With the announcement back in February from CDPR that a sequel to Cyberpunk 2077 is now officially in development, I decided I would revisit Night City and give the game its proper due, to see where it currently stands after nearly 4 years of support, patch updates, and even a DLC expansion. I know I still experience existential dread every time I say that out loud. I should still probably give some caveats before immediately jumping in though. Mainly being, I'm not going to be factoring in the Edge Runners show into this video because A, I haven't watched it, but B, I'm of the mind that a creative work shouldn't rely on an outside piece of content to justify or explain bad creative, mechanical, or narrative decisions made in a game. It should stand purely on its own merits. Also, while I'm not ignoring the history of Cyberpunk's frankly nightmarish release and that there really is no excuse for the title launching in the state that it did, I firmly believe that games can also improve over time and that developers can recover some goodwill from their initial base if they're willing to put in the effort, which CDPR clearly has done. The game in its current state is the intended experience that the devs want players to have with Cyberpunk 2077, or as close as they will ever get to it, and I'm strictly going to analyze it as that. Oh, and I'm going to assume that most of you watching this have already played the game, or at least have a fairly good understanding of the general plot, so there's not going to be a thorough breakdown of the entire story, but there will be references to back up certain arguments and claims made in regards to Cyberpunk's characterization and overall narrative. However, with all of that now out of the way, let's dive on in. If there's anything I can give CDPR, it's that the vistas and overall visuals of Cyberpunk 2077 are truly mesmerizing. Whether you're strolling under the neon glow of Japantown, tearing across the dusty plains of the Badlands, or traipsing through the rundown projects of Pacifica, every area of Night City has its own distinct qualities that really pop out. And it's clear that a huge amount of effort went into the texturing and animations for character models. In terms of sheer production value, there are very few games that offer the same caliber of aesthetics and art direction. But that, unfortunately, is as far as my praise goes with Cyberpunk 2077. Because once you pull back the veneer of the looming towers and the bustling streets, there isn't much substance offered with Night City's open world. Sure, the map is massive, but there isn't really anything to interact with outside of following quest markers, which is further juxtaposed by just how linear a lot of the missions are in this game. What I would consider Cyberpunk's main content is buried underneath a mountain of pointless filler material that has you driving clear across the map with really nothing of note happening between point A and B. I wish I was being hyperbolic, but there is quite literally a mission, quote-unquote, where you just find a random guy on the sidewalk and then just drive him to the next district over. Or how the Delamain storyline is purely a series of tedious fetch quests that eventually gifts you a vehicle as a reward, that you most likely aren't going to use because, frankly, there are way better options at your disposal, even in the early game. Unlocking fast travel markers does help soften the blow a bit, but not enough to justify having the map be this massive in scale. In fairness, there are fixers posted across town who are willing to give out a ridiculous amount of side jobs to the player, but it doesn't take very long to discover just how formulaic and repetitive they truly are. 90% of gigs consist of going to a location and either taking out a group of guards, downloading documents, installing viruses, or escorting someone to a nearby safe vehicle. There are the exceptions, but they are incredibly too few and far between. The inclusion of gigs in this game very much gives off the impression that they were purely tossed in as an afterthought to address just how empty Night City truly is. And it's not like CDPR are strangers when it comes to designing open worlds. The Witcher 3 had a vast map to explore, but there was an actual reason behind that design choice. The villages found throughout all had their own distinct problems and hardships to deal with. Between bandit raids, monster attacks, tracking down lost loved ones, dealing with haunted houses, mediating with feuding families, or hell, just playing a few rounds of Gwent with the locals. There's an incentive for players to actively discover points of interest because these towns or villages are essentially hubs of experiences. Whereas in Cyberpunk, everything is kind of haphazardly sprinkled across the map Ubisoft style with the hope that that on its own will be enough to keep players engaged. Night City has what I would often describe as a look but don't touch design philosophy. You can drive all the way out to the middle of the desert, or make your way through the pure anarchy of Dogtown, but unless a quest is specifically taking you that way, there isn't really any reason to be there. Which is a shame because I think if CDPR had made dedicated levels to complement the linear narrative and mission design, it would have given the devs more freedom to refine the other systems that exist in the game. Which brings me to my first major issue with Cyberpunk 2077, the combat. One of the most common praises that gets attached to Cyberpunk is how solid its combat mechanics are, and that it's one of the best shooters in the FPS genre. But I simply couldn't disagree more. I think the gunplay and AI pathing is fucking abysmal. I cannot tell you how many times I have cheesed entire encounters simply because enemies could not process that I was standing on a box, or even just do the bare minimum of flanking around a wall I'd be taking cover behind. The devs could have compensated for this by at the very least adding in some amount of enemy variety, but sadly NPCs don't really behave that differently from each other mechanically. Whether it's Maelstrom Thugs, the Voodoo Boys, Arasaka Guards, 6th Street Gangsters, Tiger Claws, they're all the same flavor of bullet spongy enemies that stand out in the middle of the open and let you slaughter them, just with different skins. There's never any situations during combat where I as the player have to use a certain strategy to deal with an enemy in my path. Netrunners are supposed to be the exception to this rule, but they're taken down the exact same way as every other NPC. You just might have to shoot out a camera on occasion, or take out an enemy they're using to access your implants. Most of the mainline quest boss fights, if you could really call them that, are still fundamentally broken, and Cyber Psychos are just regular enemies but with boss health bars and the zoomies because the physics engine in this game is still incredibly jank. All of this just adds another layer of tedium to an already monotonous gameplay loop. Which, I'm going to be blunt, outside of stealth, which is insanely busted by the way, given that you can kill most of the mini-bosses in Cyberpunk with takedowns, if you're not running a Netrunner/Blades build, you are absolutely wasting your time. Once your intelligence stats are high enough, you can straight up scan a group of enemies and insta-kill them, and Blades can not only block bullets, but actually ricochet back at enemies, effectively making the use case for guns in this game kind of pointless. I mean, why bother with something that requires you to scrounge around for ammo when you can just spam quick hacks or katanas due to the incredibly short recharge rate for both RAM and stamina? There's also a perk within the Blade skill tree that allows you to heal after performing melee finishers by a very considerable amount. This isn't an issue in itself, but once you combine that with the Send Beast and Chip mod, it really turns combat into even more of a joke than it already was, even on the higher difficulty modes. I understand wanting to make melee weapons a viable option if they are going to exist in the game, but it's obvious that the devs had no clue when it came to balancing any of these systems, which is somewhat embarrassing given that the 2.0 patch was supposed to overhaul the combat. However, I suppose the main defense some people will give for all this is that Cyberpunk 2077 is primarily an RPG, and that players shouldn't judge the game too harshly based on its gunplay. That the choices made during one's playthrough ultimately is what defines the experience. Which, fair enough, let's take a closer look at those RPG mechanics, shall we? So the game starts the player off by presenting them with 3 life paths to choose from for your character: Nomad, Street Kid, or Corpo. And while all of them have different intros that determine how you know or end up meeting Jackie, they don't significantly impact the gameplay. And even then, whatever option you do end up selecting gets completely undermined by the devs just suddenly rushing V and Jackie's entire friendship through a 2-minute montage. You could remove these life paths completely and it would really change nothing with the plot. They serve as little more than back history flavor text options for V during conversations, most of which, along with even attribute-based skill checks, will result in a fail.
You know, I could help patch the gaps in your convoy security. Prevent a repeat of this fiasco.
Nope, not interested. Let's hear your offer. I don't have all day.
I used to ride with nomads. Resourceful folk. Wouldn't cast anything aside until it was worn down, dead, couldn't be fixed or reused in some other way. But what you're giving these girls, not even nomads would touch that.
Please, let's not exaggerate. I give them what I can. You're looking for a friend?
Sheesh. How backwards can you be? Should for your peeps, not the implants they wear.
Hey, B! Code yellow. Got an uppity one at the gate. On the ground! Hands behind your head! Code red.
You realize personal links aren't secure, right? Could get hit with malware straight to my core. End up paying an arm and a leg for a ripper doc.
We need data from your core to pair you up with the doll.
Meaning a biometric scan?
Just that. If anything goes wrong, you can lodge a complaint. But that's never happened.
This is but one of many instances of Cyberpunk establishing an illusion of choice. The whole point of incorporating skill checks in an RPG is to give the player a sense of control over their experience based on how they've chosen to progress or level up their character. But this game will seemingly set up options for potential branching directions for a quest, only to railroad you in the precise path it wants to take. Your decision to team up with Evelyn and split the take amongst yourselves, or rat her out to Dexter Deshawn, doesn't matter because she's not around after the Konpeki Tower heist and is pretty much a non-factor for the rest of the game. Your decision to tell Dex whether or not you have the biochip doesn't matter because he still shoots you in the head regardless. Your decision to side with Netwatch or the Voodoo Boys doesn't matter because the outcome doesn't affect the main storyline in really any way. You never interact with either faction for the rest of the game, nor do they ever send anyone to take you out after everything's said and done. And while there are a plethora of different gangs with their own respective territories, you can gun down as many Valentinos, Maelstrom, Tiger Claws, Moxes, or 6th Street thugs with zero consequence because there is no bounty or reputation system aside from your street cred that you get for completing gigs and missions. Fixers will never turn you down for jobs even after helping a rival gang seize territory. You will never be denied access into Dogtown after killing Kurt Hansen, when by all accounts you definitely should be, given he is the big patty of the Phantom Liberty DLC. It's not to say that Cyberpunk offers absolutely no choice and player impact on the world, it's just that there's a severe lack of it, and the game tries to obfuscate that by tossing in meaningless flavor text or fake-out dialogue options. Cyberpunk is primarily a story/action-driven FPS with some very light RPG elements. Which then begs the question, how does the game tackle its characters and narrative themes? Well, let's address the elephant in the room. You play as V, a merc in Night City whose main goal is to make it big in an underground network called the Afterlife. I guess? All while trying to find a way to have Johnny Silverhand's Ingram not completely override his consciousness. And that's about all there is to know. I have no idea what his moral convictions are, if he even has any, if there's a particular faction or gang he favors over another, what his personality is, what drives him outside of the main storyline. It's as if the devs wanted V to be a complete blank slate for the player to project themselves onto, but also have him be an established protag like Geralt with set motivations and back histories with other characters. Which is only made worse when people like Jackie, someone who V has supposedly gone through thick and thin with, is explaining basic shit about Night City that V should already know, especially if you pick the street kid life path.
That's not Adam Smasher.
Bodyguard.
Wars. Night City legend. Bleak motherfucking one too. What's the play?
We wait. The Afterlife. Known far and wide, that name.
Oh yeah?
Some of the Nomad clan's biggest jobs are scored right here.
Place used to be a morgue. You believe that?
Who would have thunk?
I know, right? Way before our time, that. But proper burials were still a thing.
Doesn't look like your average bust.
This ain't your average badges. That's Max Tac. NCPD's apex predators. MTAC rolls in when things fly out of hand. Gonks out there, though. Just a midday snack for them.
It really just shatters any level of immersion, and while Jackie is not the only character guilty of spouting off crazy amounts of exposition, he is definitely the most prominent example. On a somewhat related note, there's also the issue of Jackie's death. The writers really tried to emphasize this being a tragic and impactful moment for V, effectively losing the only person in a Night City he cares about, but it still rings somewhat hollow because, again, we're barely given any time to be invested in Jackie as a character. And given that V only brings him up maybe a handful of times after the funeral, it really doesn't seem like he's all that torn up about losing Jackie either. You would assume he'd have extreme personal vendetta against Yorinobu, and at the very least entertain the idea of avenging his friend, but strangely enough, no. In fact, his indifference towards Arasaka throughout the rest of the game further drives home that V is nothing more than an empty vessel used to introduce the player to other characters and experience their dedicated storylines. Which isn't an inherently bad thing, but the devs really needed to pick an approach with V and commit to it. If anything, I think having Takamura as the main protag would have actually served the game way better. There would have been more room to explore the inner dealings, overall bureaucracy, and even dirty secrets of the mega-corporate world. By experiencing everything through the POV of a faithful protector of the Arasaka family, who's fallen from grace because of a setup from the Black Sheep, who has to appeal to other members of the family and organization to clear his good name. We'd see just how far allegiances can be stretched, and also be presented with a clear divide between the corporate sphere and the underbelly of Night City by having Takamura seek out unconventional help to achieve his end goals. There's a slight glimpse of that in the game, but it's cut off by all the other arbitrary shit that V has to go off and do with Johnny. Speaking of which, I think the initial premise of having the digitally preserved consciousness of Johnny Silverhand follow you around and chime in on the state of things is interesting. The issue, though, is that it's not executed all that well. One of the themes of cyberpunk as a genre is the question of what it means to be human in an age where every single aspect about you can be altered through technology. Is it possible to cybernetically replace so much of your organic material that you're no longer human? Can you actually digitally preserve someone's very essence and soul? Well, the player never gets to mull over any of that when it comes to Johnny. Or, well, what V sees of Johnny anyway, because the game makes it explicitly clear from the moment go that the engram on the biochip is not Johnny.
It's just a copy of the engram. I'm out there somewhere. Gotta be.
It's an AI that mimics what it thinks Johnny's personality is/was. All of the memories and experiences from before 2077 are not engram Johnny's. This is further reinforced later on by Alt.
Would you rather just talk to him?
Discussion with any isolated construct is pointless. I can simply read it like any other segment of code. The sole human factor here is you.
Yeah, well, said human factor's rapidly running out of time.
The real Silverhand died 50 years ago, and having the cat be let out of the bag so early on eliminates any potential for that being unveiled as a plot twist, or something to be debated between V and engram Johnny. His motivations for helping V are also not properly established or fleshed out. From his POV, he's essentially been given a second chance at life. His old flame and former band members are still around, and he still has an axe to grind with Arasaka. Not to mention, he's more than capable of stopping V from trying to find a way to excise him completely, especially considering V's condition will only get worse over time, but just doesn't because he randomly changes his mind.
What do you want?
And I've processed some shit, changed my mind. Don't want you dead anymore.
I guess you could argue that engram Johnny doesn't recognize Night City anymore, and that everything that he once held dear and valued is gone. There simply isn't anything left to live on for anymore. The only thing that matters now is destroying Mikoshi, and he'd rather have V be the one to carry that out. Except he makes multiple attempts to convince V to let him take the driver's seat, and one of the endings results in Johnny deciding to steal V's body. We also shouldn't forget that the personality the engram is based on is that of a narcissist and total sociopath. It is extremely difficult to buy that someone so self-absorbed like Johnny would ever sacrifice his personal interests, especially when he stands to gain so much. And while I'm not against the concept of giving the player the option to form some conflict resolution between the two of them and actually develop a friendship by the end of the main storyline, it's Johnny's very obvious vested interests that demolishes the execution of that idea.
Fuck, it's good to be back.
Also, I wanted to touch on this subject during the more gameplay-focused section of the video, but considering it heavily ties into the main storyline, I figured it'd be more fitting to include it here. But I think the ticking clock aspect isn't implemented all that well in Cyberpunk. While this game doesn't have quite the same problem that Fallout 4 has, where you watch your infant son get kidnapped, and then the moment you escape the vault, you're effectively thrust into a side quest, it is still really strange how there's practically zero consequence for taking your time with completing all the side content in Cyberpunk, despite the entire narrative of the game being centered around the premise that you are dying and only have 5 weeks to live. You must hurry. A ticking clock can be an effective mechanic for not only pinpointing or emphasizing what the main objectives are for the player, but also adding more weight and tension to the overall gameplay because there is now a sense of urgency for completing those tasks and the manner in which you accomplish them. I mean, imagine if Time Crisis, Dead Rising 1, or Majora's Mask didn't have any negative consequences for failing to meet the time limit. It would pretty much diminish the stakes, right? Well, that is the precise problem with Cyberpunk. The game tries to hammer home that you're running out of options and that time is of the essence, but you can also help Judy with her plan to take down Clouds, crack a cold kidnapping case by rescuing River's nephew, assist the Avocados with stealing a tank, disguise yourself as a famous hitman and determine who the new leader of Dogtown is going to be, compete in multiple boxing matches across town, get Johnny's old band back together to play a reunion gig, help a guy crucify himself on a cross. Not really sure why that one is in the game if I'm being honest. I'm not suggesting that Cyberpunk absolutely has to have a fail state for not completing the main storyline within 5 in-game weeks, but hell, there should be some incentive for the player to do it, or if nothing else, have the estimated time frame for V to be 6 months to live instead. Which brings us to probably the most interesting aspect of this game, the final act. At a certain point, Cyberpunk will ultimately bring the player to a crossroads and present them with multiple avenues for trying to remove the biochip from V's head. You can seek out Arasaka and make a deal with Hanako, allow Johnny to take over and lead an assault with Rogue and Arasaka Tower to destroy Mikoshi, or call Pan Am and formulate a plan with the Aldecados. I really wish the rest of the game had this level of effort put into it, because this section is where your dialogue choices actually somewhat matter and where it plays most like an RPG. Certain characters can live or die based on what path you take. There's a weight and impact there that is pretty much non-existent for 90% of the main storyline. However, that's not to say that it's without fault, because regardless of what option you do end up selecting, it's all still trivialized by the game revealing that there is no actual cure in store for V. The biochip has irreversibly changed V's body to accommodate Johnny's engram and views V as an intruder, leaving only one of 2 outcomes: V having just 6 months to live, or Johnny taking full control. Of course, you can determine the context for how those plot points culminate, but that's about it. Everything you've done up to this point has effectively been meaningless, and while I understand having a tragic ending like this falls in line with the cyberpunk genre, it's not all that rewarding from a gameplay standpoint. You have all these supposed branching narratives with dedicated cutscenes, but they all still merge back into the same 2 outcomes. It's not quite the same problem that I highlighted with the intro sequence or the skill check system, but it's still another instance of the game giving off the illusion of there being a deeper sense of player choice and interactivity than there actually is. That is, if we're exclusively looking at Cyberpunk's base game content, because the Phantom Liberty DLC does present a third alternative. If you give Songbird over to Reed, he'll eventually offer to fly you to DC to have the surgery done to remove the biochip, but due to how invasive the procedure is, it results in V not being able to handle most implants.
Your brain can manage your personal link and simple code processors. But any use of a combat implant, well, it could kill you. I'm sorry, V, but the life you used to know is gone.
Which, again, the game tries to pass off as this really devastating moment, but it just falls flat because part of the reason why V is even in this situation is specifically because he decided to pursue the whole high-risk mercenary life and fuck around with prototype Arasaka technology. Like, oh boo-hoo, it's so terrible V won't be able to use his god-tier implants to slaughter fools. He'll just have to use a regular gun for that now, like everyone else. And yeah, being in a coma for 2 years is pretty shitty, to put it mildly, but it's better than, you know, being dead, or only having 6 months to live. I think people want to pin the bugs as Cyberpunk's biggest flaw, and while the bugs definitely were/are a problem, they are not the problem. The bitter reality plaguing Cyberpunk 2077 is that no amount of patch updates, hotfixes, or DLCs can fix fundamentally bad game design. And believe me, I really wish there was a phenomenal core to Cyberpunk. Hopefully CDPR can make a solid experience with its sequel. But the revisionism surrounding 2077, based purely on the devs having improved the game's general performance from its initial launch, is one that I don't accept. At least not to the point of labeling it a worthwhile RPG or FPS. And I think that revisionism has clouded some people from recognizing the very legitimate issues/criticisms Cyberpunk is riddled with. Games absolutely can improve over time, but there has to be a good foundation to build upon. However, with all of that said, if you made it this far, then I seriously appreciate you watching the video. I know this is a bit of a curveball from the usual format, but I've been meaning to get around to making a dedicated game review for the longest time, and I'm definitely planning on doing more in the future. If there's anything you'd like to see covered on the channel, then feel free to drop suggestions down below in the comments. Either way, thanks for watching, and until next time.